Please. So I give you Stuart Hamilton from NAPLE. He's the president of NAPLE, and he put together a wonderful collection of panelists to talk about community responses to crisis. So from now on, all yours.
Thanks, Anka. Thanks, and actually, really big thanks indeed, because the organisers have been great to us over the last week or so, finding time to walk us through a lot of technical issues and get us ready for this session. So thanks to Anka and to Claudia and to everybody working at Occupy for hosting us here. I'm Stuart Hamilton. I'm the head of libraries development at the local government management agency in Ireland, and I'm very happy that everybody's joining us here this afternoon. Today we're going to talk about crisis and what libraries and library staff do when they're faced with a crisis. And, you know, we face crisis all the time, really, almost as part of our everyday work, you know, whether that's facing issues around staffing, funding, the sorts of challenges that come with trying to maintain visibility for libraries in the face of perhaps indifference from governments. And then other things when we get our materials or our services challenged. All of these are crises which we sort of face, and over the years we've come up with methods to deal with them. We do training, we share best practices, we're always sharing information, and being able to address these sorts of challenges and mini crises, I guess, are kind of part of what makes us good librarians. This year, though, something different happened, of course. 2020 has been a very interesting year for us, and that's what we're going to talk about today, because one of the biggest challenges came along for our profession. And the problems that have been posed by COVID-19 and the global pandemic have proved very far-reaching. So what I think is interesting about this sort of period is that, you know, the first 3 months of the year, all of us, literally the entire global library community, were plunged into a bit of a shared crisis. One that was, you know, running concurrently in all of our countries, and indeed has turned out to be quite prolonged. Possibly the biggest crisis we've ever faced as a profession, certainly in the contemporary age maybe of libraries. And all of a sudden, as I say, we had this big shared problem that was happening to all of us all at once. So today we're going to look at how sort of libraries in 6 different countries responded to this situation. And we're going to hear what we had in common and where we started to diverge from each other. And we're going to hear what we learned from each other, what we took on and implemented, and what we left by the side. So I'm going to chair this session with 2 hats on. One is my job with the local government management agency in Ireland, where I'm the head of libraries development, and I work with 30 chief librarians, as we call them, or city and county librarians as they're known in Ireland, to implement the National Public Library Strategy. But my other hat is the president of NAPLE, which is the National Authorities on Public Libraries in Europe. And the NAPLE Forum brings together people with similar jobs to me in more than 20 countries around Europe to discuss the sorts of issues that are facing public libraries. And we got ourselves together when the crisis hit from March onwards to talk about what was happening in our countries and how we were going to try and tackle the crisis in front of us. And the purpose of this was what librarians do very well, which was to learn from each other and to share approaches that we could use on the ground. Now, we produced 2 different reports during this period, and my colleague Maeve is going to put the links to those reports into the chat window. And they looked at the period when we were all locked down and the period when we started emerging from the lockdown and reopening our services. And what these reports showed was that we initially had a lot in common with the approaches that we took, but that over time we diverged very slightly. We began very quickly, all of us as a community, to pivot maybe towards providing more online services, developing contact and collect services and services to people who were cocooning in their houses. But then over time, we started taking slightly different approaches with regards to health and safety. Quarantine would be included at that, and then the speed at which we were able to open up. So a lot of experimentation, a lot of different approaches. The panelists here today have been specially chosen to give you a variety of perspectives on how libraries dealt with this crisis in Europe. And I say specially chosen because we've got different levels here. We have the library as institution, a director of a library. We've got people who are in charge of multiple libraries across an authority or a municipality, an urban or rural area. And then we've got people who work with entire library systems at national level. So we're really going to be very able to sort of share this sort of local to national to international approach, because one of the purposes of the session is to see what approaches could be replicated from the local through to the national and through to the international. We're also going to look a little bit beyond COVID as well, and to perhaps use a rather overused phrase, it's apparently very bad form to let a good crisis go to waste. Well, what have we learned from this period, and what are we going to take forward beyond the COVID sort of crisis time into our library services in the future? And we might get into a little bit about perceptions of the service at this point by our users, by our politicians and funders, and by ourselves. So I hope you're going to be able to go away from the session with a better idea of how colleagues have tried to deal with things, what sort of approaches we've got, and maybe go away with a few ideas to implement in your own backyard. Now, to do this, we're going to have a conversation. We don't have any PowerPoints. We don't have any presentations. We've got a nice panel set up. The Hop-In platform lends itself quite nicely to this. I think life I wanted to be, or maybe I was a chat show host. So I'm going to bring all of my chat show abilities here with the panelists and get them to open up with their juicy COVID stories and see what we can share with you today. I'd like to try and moderate a conversation here. We're going to start with a few sort of shared questions, but I'm encouraging panelists to basically pick up on the points that their colleagues are making, and if they have points to come back, then I'm very happy to facilitate the conversation that way. And as I previously discussed with my panelists, if you want to do that, a good old-fashioned hand up and a wave in the air, or a scratch of the nose, and I'll try and pick that up. Now, also, I encourage you very strongly to make use of the chat window, where I'll be trying to pick up on questions that come in from you, and we will go to a more of a general, hopefully a general Q&A towards the end of the session. But if I can, I'll try and bring in your questions as we go, and please feel free to offer observations as well. You don't often get a panel of this quality in one place, so you really want to try to take advantage of having everybody here. Right, okay, well, you're probably wondering who these wonderful panelists are, and I'm going to introduce them now, but of course in their interventions they're going to tell you a little bit more about the work that they do and the environments that they work in. Now, I'm going to begin with my colleague Silke Nierman from Germany. She's been working for 30 years in German public library. She's giving a wave. Everybody needs to give a wave. It's like one of those panel games. But Silke has been the CEO of the Stadtbibliothek in Gütersloh since 2015, which is in the North Rhine-Westphalia region of Germany. She's also chairwoman of the section in the German Library Association that looks at library systems and libraries that serve areas with 100,000 to 400,000 inhabitants, so a big area there. Second panelist is Jakob Pettison, giving you the wave there. He's the library director in Copenhagen in Denmark and is chairman of the Danish Public Library's ebook service. He's responsible for the Copenhagen library strategy, and he basically comes from a career in government where he was head of the division for libraries in the Danish Agency for Culture. He's got extensive experience in national library policy. Catherine Gallagher is a colleague of mine here in Ireland, just down the road from me in physical sense, and she's currently the county librarian in Dunleary Rathdown County Council. And in this role, she oversees the library service for the county, and she also has a broader brief that includes arts, culture, and Creative Ireland. And she's presently the chair of the county librarian section in our Irish Library Association. And then Tabitha Witherick is joining us from the UK. She's the head of library service and customer experience at Libraries Unlimited, which is a charity that runs the libraries across Devon and Torbay, which is in the southwest of England. She's a member of the executive team for Libraries Unlimited. She's responsible for the delivery of experiences and services across 54 libraries in a large rural part of the UK. Joris Errett is joining us from Flanders in Belgium, and he's a policy officer at the Department of Culture, Youth and Media of the Government of Flanders. And before this, he was a library consultant for 14 years for the province of East Flanders. He's also the representative of Flanders on NAPLE, and he's a teacher at the most difficult word I'm going to have to pronounce today, the Artveld High School, where he trains young librarians. And then our final panelist is Franziska Bettker from Switzerland, another colleague of mine on the NAPLE board. Franziska began her professional life as a journalist for Radio DRS2 in Switzerland, mostly as a critic for literature, theatre and arts. She's been the director of Bibliomedia Switzerland since 2016, which is a public foundation that supports public libraries with media and ideas. And she's a member of the Biblio Swiss board since last year. So this is a great panel, and I'm going to let them speak to you now. I've given everybody a setup question, which is going to enable them to make a bit of a slightly longer introduction. Silke, I want to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your sort of position and job, what it involves? And then can you share with us at what point did you realize this year that you were facing a crisis?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the invitation to all, and yeah, hi from Germany. Yes, my job is the managing of the Public Library of Gütersloh, and this is a little special public library because we are organized as an enterprise or business organization with all yeah, highly independence in finance, personal and organization, but also high personal responsibility of myself. So have a very independent standing in my city and in my surrounding, in my work and in our decisions in the library. This will be maybe a little bit special for the discussion or some decisions we made in this crisis. Yes, we all in the library knew that is a crisis in March when we changed our organization only in 30 minutes from we had a meeting on Monday afternoon with all staff. I have 33 staff members, and we have also 9 school libraries running, and we have a big meeting of all to discuss how can we manage the COVID things in the community. And then came the information from the civil government or city government, okay, you have closed tomorrow in the morning, no work, separated teams, no contact each other. And this was in 30 minutes, we sat in our library and thought, okay, this is new. This is something we never, ever had before. And so there we all knew on middle of March, this is a crisis. And this will be a crisis. Open end at this time. I can't. Yeah, I can't hear you.
As a moderator, I haven't exactly set the world on fire there, have I, by muting myself? I apologize for that. Silke, we're going to come back to you, obviously, to hear exactly what you did in that sort of circumstance next. But Jakob, do you want to sort of talk us about what happened in Copenhagen?
Yes, actually, it all happened pretty quickly. There was a government announcement on the evening of March 11 that a lot of functions were going to close down. So we were told directly on TV that this was going to happen, and then you have to prepare for it the next morning. But actually, already a week before or so, we had contingency plans in our municipality, where our director had said which functions were very core and necessary in our city government, and the libraries were not included. So we knew that we might have to close the library. We knew it was a possibility, but it was announced by our Prime Minister in the evening, and the next day we began closing down and sending everyone home, and that was quite an unusual situation. So already on the evening of the 11th of March, I knew that this was quite an unusual crisis. But perhaps I have time to come back to it later. But we've had a terrorist attack across the street, so we've tried something a bit similar.
Ah, yes, now that's interesting. We might talk a bit about sort of the learnings from that. Catherine, what about yourself in here?
Yeah, I suppose, hello everybody, and to say I'm going to be giving my answers in the context of my experience in Dún Laoghaire Rathdown. I suppose like that, we had been following with interest the COVID situation as was developing in Denmark, in Italy, in France and Spain. And there had been kind of talks around business continuity plans. Libraries didn't feature on that. The local authority is an essential service, but libraries were not deemed essential within that. So again, that was quite an interesting piece and an interesting kind of piece of work. And a crisis team and that had been assembled. And I suppose then things moved very quickly. Our Prime Minister was abroad, and suddenly there was a State of the Nation address, and schools were going to close as from that evening. And I think that a conversation started in terms of schools were going to close and cultural organisations, and where did libraries fit? And at a local level, where did libraries fit? Because a number of people, their commentary straight away from the public was, okay, the school is closed, but I'll be able to bring the kids to the library. And that idea of the library also closing just didn't kind of register with people. And so it was then decided really very rapidly that that was it. The libraries were now also being deemed to be an indoor space. They were going to close as well. And we literally closed our door to the public that evening at 8 o'clock. But the staff still came to work on the Friday.
Yeah. And
so it was that suddenness of, and I think really nothing like that had ever really happened before. We had never had that much kind of contact from our Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, you know, to fly home, because it was the weekend of St. Patrick's weekend, which is such an important weekend for Irish, to spread the Irish story worldwide. So normally the entire government is dispatched all around the world with shamrock and really kind of fly the green flag. This was a really kind of unusual experience. And then for staff to come, and again, that's when you knew. We'd had an inkling before. We organise a big festival every March called Mountains to Sea, and it attracts a lot of international speakers. And I suppose about 3 or 4, the 7th, 8th of March, we suddenly had our international speakers looking to cancel.
Yeah.
Their insurance underwriter was getting cold feet, they were getting cold feet themselves. And suddenly you had this sense of, okay, this is really starting to come very close to home now. And I think that's when you knew it was something different. I suppose as a local authority, we respond to crises locally, weather warnings, all of that. We'd look after all of that at a local level. There would be experience of dealing with crises, but I suppose the global nature and the length of the period has been really a new experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm. So Tabitha, in the UK, I mean, you know, you're across the water from us here in Ireland. Is it a similar sort of situation?
So yes, I think it was fairly similar in some respects, but just to briefly touch on my role, I think you wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
So I'm head of library service and customer experience at Libraries Unlimited, and I've only been in this particular role for 7 weeks. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I was actually a service delivery manager. So I was working very closely with the local library supervisors across quite a dispersed geographical area, and I think the moment that I realised that I was in crisis, so we'd obviously been following what was happening nationally and across the world, watching the news and following the data. But the moment that I realised that we were in a crisis, I think was quite a personal moment, really. It was in middle of March. I think I'd been through the longest and toughest week of my life in terms of, you know, managing people and how they were feeling and how they were wanting to protect their communities. And it felt a little bit like time had stood still and we were waiting for a government announcement that just didn't seem to want to come. So in the middle of that week, I literally was on my knees and I was crying, I was exhausted, and I actually felt quite helpless. So I think that moment I knew that there was something that was quite big, and we were in this crisis. And of course I didn't stay down there for long. I pulled myself up, I went and got a cup of tea and got back to what needed to be done. And we're as a charity, we have a board of trustees, so we are commissioned by local government, but we sit outside of it. So we have the board of trustees that have strategic oversight of the charity. So we were able to make the decision to close our libraries before the government announced closures of libraries and the national lockdown. So yes, it was that moment. I'll never forget it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. With Silke talking about the library approach you have there, Silke, as you said, from a sort of business perspective or slightly different to that, and then with the charity there, so you were actually able to close, as you said before, Tabitha, before the sort of government. Okay, that's interesting. So there with Tabitha and with Catherine and Jakob, both of you all mentioned, the government announcement, waiting for that announcement or seeing how it would go. If we move on to Joris in Flanders, Belgium, we're getting a bit closer to the government now. So Joris, what was your sort of perspective as this went on? Because you were probably going to be responsible for a bit of communicating that message, I guess.
Yes, I was. Well, my role is a bit different. As you mentioned before, I work for the Department of Culture, Youth and Media of the government of Flanders. The situation in Belgium is a bit complicated, as many things are in Belgium. There is a federal state in Belgium, and there the different communities and regions have a large autonomy. And culture and public libraries are an exclusive competence of the region. So I work for the region. I do not work for the whole of Belgium. That's just important for you to know. My office is in Brussels, the beautiful capital of Belgium and of Europe. And Brussels is also the city that is visited a lot by many international tourists. And in January and February, when I made a stroll after my lunch, and I went to the Grand Place of Brussels, I saw the Chinese visitors visiting Brussels. And then sometimes I made a joke about the virus, and I said I'm going to hug some Chinese visitors so I can get on sick leave for a week or two. How naive was I then? Because then we were joking about it, but we did not joke for very long. Because the moment I really began to realize that something big was going on, was on the 12th of March, I believe. I arrived in the morning at the office, and my boss, he called us and he said, yeah, the management had decided that we all had to work from home starting the next day. And we did not have a plan to do that. We had some tools, some digital tools. For example, Microsoft Teams was installed on our laptops a few weeks before that. But the training sessions to use it, to learn to use it, were scheduled some weeks after. So we were unprepared. And I was asked by my manager then to make a plan about communicating, about working together with those digital tools in just a few hours. But we tried to do that. At that time, I must confess, we still believed that it was a matter of a couple of weeks. We would go home and work there for a couple of weeks. At most, we would be back, we believed then, after Easter, after the Easter holiday. But as you all know, it turned out a bit different. I think the moment I really started to believe that this was a really big crisis was a couple of weeks after the announcement of the lockdown in Belgium. And then it slowly became clear for me that this was going to last for a long time, and that the consequences would be very, very critical. Not only for the libraries, of course, but also for society in a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, Francisca, in Switzerland, I mean, I've got one of my best friends lives in Switzerland. Was it the same sort of situation there for you, or were you very well prepared?
You think that we were prepared. That's
my aunt is Swiss as well. So.
Well, yeah, hi from Switzerland. Switzerland is, as you may know, or maybe not, a country with no national agenda or ministry or law for public libraries. So there is a lot of responsibility on a community and canton, like regional level. And that was probably kind of marking our way of dealing with this crisis. So in Switzerland, federal government announced lockdown on March 16, and it was declared to take place until April 19. So there was like division of 1 month of lockdown in the beginning. And the moment I started to think that it's going to be very big, that was end of February. I live in a city called Basel. It's a small city in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. And it's a city with a big carnival. So crowded streets and everything, crowded bars, restaurants. And on very short notice, the cantonal government forbid to have a Fastnacht carnival. And then it was clear that this COVID thing was really big and it was coming real fast, and that it was going to occupy us for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to move on, but I think it's worth recognizing in the chat there's some interesting pieces sort of coming through there about the libraries open versus closed, and I think we're going to get onto some of that in the discussion, because it's easier in some ways to us referring to ourselves as having closed, but of course, as I'm sure we're about to discuss, we didn't close. So many things went on when the doors were closed, but I think we'll certainly pick that up in some of the other responses here. I'm interested in, Jakob, I might start with you just on this one, because you'd mentioned in your intervention there, you had a terrorist attack in Copenhagen. I'm interested to hear from everybody about whether, the challenges that came up were completely new, or whether you were able to sort of say, okay, I recognize this challenge, this is how I'm going to react to it, or, I'm missing the tools to deal with this challenge. But Jakob, were you able to take any learning from the previous situation here?
Yes, what I was referring to was that we had a terrorist attack in Copenhagen a month or so after the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo in 2015. One of the attacks happened just across the street on the synagogue across our street, so we had to close the library, and we also had to talk with our employees and calm them a bit, and also our public. We now have a military guarding the library permanently because there's a synagogue across. So that was quite a unique situation. But I think the learning was about communication, and I think we actually we already have a very centralized communication system, because we have a joint call center for our 20 libraries, and also a digital library where we have people manning that digital library, and that proved to be very important also, that they could work from home during this crisis. So we were able to communicate both with our employees and with the public through these channels, and I think this kind of a bit centralized communication and also quite frequent communication with our public proved to be quite valuable. And we also had that kind of communication following this attack, because was it safe to go to the library? And all this actually trying to calm our community. And I think the experiences from that period were quite valuable also here.
Silke, at the library level itself, there were you kind of ready? Were you able to send people home and tell them to carry on doing their jobs at home, or how did it work for you? And I need your microphone.
So it was a little bit different. We organized some staff members on digital sources and possibilities to work at home, but not all. This was the plan for this year in the next month, not on March. And so we have to decide very quickly what can we do, what can some staff members do in the library, what staff can do, can work at home. So this is right. This was very new, very quickly, very exciting for all. But we learned some lessons from the last years. We used for our further development in the library the approach of design thinking since 2018. And one central thing in design thinking is a high level of error tolerance. So we said, okay, we try something, and then we looked if it runs or not, and then we change our organization or our decisions in another way. And this was for our staff members was a little bit a good feeling that we all, also myself, didn't know in this situation what will be the right way or the safe way. And so there we have some experiences from this approach, design thinking in this crisis. And also we worked since several years with digital tools. Also, we try something, we play with some tools, and this was also a good experience and a good basic to get in this crisis, in this time, and to manage it. Some colleagues of me immediately have ideas for new digital services, for video tools, to use it for communication with our clients and with the community, and also how we can manage the communication under ourselves. So this was for us the two parts, design thinking experiences and experiences with digital tools and services for years.
I think that's really interesting. The design thinking obviously is something we as a community have been talking about for a few years. So I really think that the kind of don't be afraid to fail, or as you put it, the high error tolerance as perhaps making people feel slightly more comfortable, that I think is very interesting. Catherine, I'm going to come to you, then Tabitha, because I know Tabitha, you guys also looked at design thinking during this period. But Catherine, I'm reminded that did you, in DLR, which is what we call Catherine's county, did you find these challenges completely new? I know you also had some staff who sort of really came up with some sort of new ideas and
I think it was interesting to pick up on what Yara said there, and the whole thing around teams. About the week before we went into this crisis, we'd had a training session on Teams, and the trainer said, this is for when the zombie apocalypse happens, so don't worry, you probably won't need to use this. And about a week later, everybody was like, we should have paid more attention at the Teams talk. But like that too, no, we really hadn't considered the option of remote working or working from home for our frontline staff. I would have responsibility for 104 staff, and of that, the majority would normally be frontline. That is their role. And I suppose, interestingly, at that point, we may have closed our library doors, but we were very keen to stress that the service remained open, and actually remained open in a very significant way. And I think the communication piece for us as an organisation, the decision was made very early on that we spoke as one corporate organisation. The libraries didn't speak independently, the organisation spoke, and that was both to staff and to the wider audience. And that can bring an element of frustration as well sometimes, because you're like, you know, what's happening? But we worked on that. We pivoted very quickly online, and we also pivoted very quickly to encouraging people to join online, use the services online, come back online very, very fast. We also then pivoted a lot of our events online and committed to doing children's events particularly, and to provide a support around the literacy piece. Very quickly then we also got involved with a local community response to the service, in that there was a commitment that we would support the cocooners, people over 70 who'd been asked to stay at home. And at national level, there was a commitment that local authorities would support via community call, which is playing on a volunteer culture that's very strong in Ireland, where you would have a pool of volunteers. People would contact the local authority for what they needed. You would match with a volunteer and a service would be delivered. So if you need your messages, your prescription, anything like that, it'd be done through the form of the community call. And that then actually engaged a lot of staff and provided interesting work for people and very different work. And I suppose I would have said that the particular skill set of library staff in terms of a front-facing customer service made them very suitable for this type of work, and people found it quite interesting and useful. So there was almost that sense of people were doing their at-home work, their online work, and then their community call work as well. And also a huge emphasis on staff training and upskilling while they were perhaps, so again, that you use the situation, that you have the time to do all those courses you never had time to do, and that when we reopen to the public, you're delivering an even more enhanced service.
Yeah, no, that I think is interesting, and I see Sarah from Peru making a comment in the chat there as well. That sort of, you know, that upskilling for library staff. We did try to take advantage of some of this sort of, not necessarily downtime, but we'll talk about professional development, I think. Or actually, you know, Tabitha, I know you were bringing the skills of the staff up even during this in the area that you work in. But before you might share a few words on that, what sort of, were you able to take any learning into the crisis, or was it all
So yeah, I think there was a fair amount of I think, you know, we've been through mini crises before, and we have structures in place to kind of pull together teams to make stuff happen. But I think the difference here was that this affected everybody's emotional well-being, and actually that bit of work, you know, is completely different to anything we've done before. Everybody, as well as their work life, everybody was going through their own personal crisis. And so at the beginning of lockdown, but then also the whole roller coaster of being, you know, in an environment at home, working from home with family around, not being able to go out. So that personal crisis, that roller coaster, and supporting people through that was hugely time consuming but vital. So actually that was something that we spent a lot of time thinking about, and I have to say that some of the stuff that maybe we've been working towards really came to life during this period. So interestingly, differently to Catherine's approach, you know, we are very much about local libraries serving local community, and I'm not saying that you're not, Catherine, but those local voices are really vital. So supervisors embedded within local communities, knowing their communities, local leadership is something that we've worked really hard on. And so what I saw happen was that there was something very organic in terms of how those that went home to work really started to think about what their local needs were, and the stuff that they were putting out via social media and digital events and things were really kind of hooked into what they felt was needed locally, the telephone calls that they made to the community members that they knew were isolated, those types of things. And so we saw leadership popping up all over the organisation. We had a Trello board that very quickly kind of came to life, lots of sharing happening. So across 54 libraries, everybody usually goes in on a daily basis and delivers a service at a very local level. But what we saw happening was that the team started to communicate themselves across 54 libraries and really kind of felt empowered to do that without being led to do so by, you know, the leadership team. So in that way, it was a really exciting time to see that happening. We started to have, which again was led by a centre manager, set up team Zoom calls. So we had time where people came together and really kind of shared their experiences. We had some fun, we'd dress up, we'd sing some songs. But that team building that came out of this was phenomenal, and it's not something that we would have been able to plan or foresee. So yeah, some really powerful stuff happening, I think.
That is. I'd also say, from my perspective, leading a small team with libraries development, yeah, it's actually, you know, in some ways brought people closer together in terms of working. That's right. I'm going to step it up to sort of the level that Joris and Franziska work at. Franziska, you know, I suppose with you know, Bibliomedia Switzerland, it's that sort of, you're trying to provide some degree of national coordination or leadership there for the other people. I know you've given a description of the Swiss situation as being slightly different in terms of national, but what did you find yourself needing to know, or were you ready equipped to deal with this?
Well, you know, in Switzerland, as there is no real national structure for public libraries, it's mostly the Library Association that became this kind of information hub during the beginning of the crisis, and then stayed in this role for several weeks and months. And my colleagues told me that they literally got 20 to 30 mails every day, and like Switzerland is a rather small country, from libraries asking like, yeah, what shall we do? How shall we react? And so this like counseling, yeah, turned out to be quite important, as there is, as I said, this kind of lack of institutional or governmental providing. So in the end, I think for the Library Association in Switzerland, the crisis turned out to be somehow even an opportunity, because they could really serve their members really well, and they could even get new members that were convinced by the way how the association treated the situation. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, they find themselves actually showing value in a way they were able to deal, they were equipped to do, but perhaps weren't expecting to find themselves doing on such a scale. Yeah. Joris, you touched a little bit on earlier, you know, the fact that, you know, you needed to jump pretty quickly into learning these sorts of digital tools. Did you, you know, was it a very steep learning curve, or did you find that people had experience from previous, you know, they took to it once they knew what they were doing? Did they take to it?
Yeah, well, it was a steep learning for some, yeah, definitely. But on the other hand, I was amazed how quickly you roll into a new way of working and organizing yourself. And I must say, I like a physical meeting, but I have learned the benefits of digital meetings, I learned to appreciate them. And it created new possibilities. And I think also the libraries picked those possibilities up.
Yeah,
definitely.
So,
but I would like to refer to what Franziska said about communication and information, because that's something we experienced in Belgium, in Flanders. Maybe the crucial element in the beginning of the crisis was the lack of clear information. And suddenly you were confronted with an unexpected situation. Everything was shut down. And in Flanders, at first it was rather clear. It was a lockdown. All the businesses, the shops, and the libraries had to close. But then, after a few days, the National Security Council in Belgium decided that public libraries should remain open. They were considered as an essential public service, which was very nice, but they had to offer a limited service, takeaway service, home delivery service, something like that. And although we were honored to be regarded as an essential service, it brought some tension between local municipalities, local libraries, and the federal level, because, yeah, especially in the beginning of the crisis, there was quite some anxiety. People did not know, did not understand the virus. How dangerous was it exactly? What were the risks exactly? There was not enough hygienic material, not enough mouth masks. A lot of the insights we have today were not available at that time. So that brought some tension, and we played our role in that. And in the end, the National Security Council decided, okay, end of discussion, you have to remain open. You are an essential service. And then the public libraries adapted very quickly, and they implemented those takeaway services. And then, of course, the need for concrete guidelines for help in implementing the general measures of the government into real practice, that need became visible. And that's a moment when the Library Association and we and ourselves tried to help our best. And I must say, I'm a bit ahead now, but the international level, the international colleagues played for us a very important role in that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about information sharing, sort of, nationally and internationally. But before I do that, I also want to, well, congratulations on being declared an essential service. I think that's, as you said, maybe a double-edged sword, but actually, I think that's really positive for libraries as a whole. One of the things that happened in Ireland, Catherine referred earlier on to a national speech that was made by the Taoiseach, and he mentioned librarians in the primetime TV address. And we were kind of blown away and also sort of, really happy that there'd been a recognition that we would have a role to play in all of this sort of thing. And another piece on communications, Jakob mentioned there just how important it was to get clear comms. Catherine mentioned that corporate voice. I found it interesting was that, the people above us, in central government and even in the center of everything, they also didn't know what they were dealing with. So as you said, Joris, in the first few days, there were quick decisions. It seemed like everyone was on top of things. And then as we've gone on, there became these gaps in the information that we ended up having to fill ourselves, and quarantining materials, which we might get onto in a little bit, was one of those sort of areas. Because nobody else was going to think about that sort of thing, except us. It was very low down the list of priorities. But Silke, you had an interesting experience in Germany where, as I understand it, your library found itself sort of in the middle of a second lockdown almost, or a local lockdown. And I wonder, did you must have all of a sudden been a font of information. I know people from the United States came looking for you to talk about it. Did you find yourself sort of sharing information with colleagues around the rest of Germany to help them, adjust services, or did you find yourself pulling information from colleagues in the rest of Germany?
Yes, I'm working as a member of a section in the German Library Association, and therefore I have a good and large network with many library managers in Germany. And this is also I think the third international conference where I will be there. So I heard many things around the world about measures and decisions in this crisis. And this is also for me very important, and this is also the communication under us librarians and library people. And our experience in Gütersloh with a second lockdown after we opened on May and in the first day of May, And then we have in June the second lockdown. There we have the experiences from the first steps to use it in the second lockdown. So we have some routine in managing the crisis. This was also a good feeling for us. And I learned that it's either you talk with colleagues in Germany or with colleagues in the neighborhood or with colleagues in Ireland or in Denmark, all have the same problems and all searching the same solutions of this crisis and have the same ideas. We also introduced teams. In the first days of lockdown, we get an offer from our IT, and I said, okay, we made it. It's if some people of mine staff have had problems, it's not the problem for me. We had to introduce teams, and this is what I hear from all of you. We have to manage the communication under each other and the communication with the community. We have to search good digital services. We have to search good organization ideas to manage the entrance of people in our libraries under hygiene and masks and all the COVID things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, Catherine, I might come to you from there because, and also I'd like to sort of, you know, for the other panelists, if you hear something that you want to come back with immediately, now we're into that sort of part of the meeting where we can put our hands up and go for it. But Catherine, you know, you've in here in Dublin, where we're sort of sitting broader Dublin, we've actually gone back a step, haven't we, in the last week or so, and we're not exactly in full lockdown, but we have more restrictions, and in some ways you've had to take a step back, haven't you?
Yeah.
Have you been able? What have you brought in terms of learning first stage into this? Is it still all about communications, or has it been easier to go backward?
It's, in a sense, the learning.
I need your microphone in there.
Yeah. I think, in a sense, can people hear me? Yeah. Well, in a sense, the on one level, it was easier to go back. It was kind of flagged. We sort of knew that we might be going back. The government published a roadmap last Wednesday, which essentially takes us to April, May of 2021 with 5 levels. And almost straight away, there was the sense that Dublin was going to be moving up a level into a tighter kind of lockdown. And it was quite clear on that, the model of service that libraries were to deliver. So a lot of the communication was a lot easier. You were able to update staff last Thursday. If this happens, we will be going to the risk assessments that existed for this period. This is what we will be doing. And I think part of the experience of COVID has been you're managing people, but you're even more managing emotion. And people have so many emotions around all of this and around the situation. And that having to go back was really, really difficult for library staff. And I have to say personally, I worked in the biggest public library in Ireland. I never thought I'd be closing it down again.
Yeah.
I thought we would be staying open. And that was difficult because suddenly you were very obviously reversing. And you were putting in place a system that had been in place, that we had used. We had very quickly, our roadmap that we had prior to the reopening, we had speeded it up. So we'd very quickly moved to try and let the public back into our spaces. And so having to now tell them no. But I was determined to finish on a good note. So we had run a Lego competition this summer, and we had entries around imagining a world without kind of COVID. And so we wrapped up on Friday before we closed with the presentation and the prize giving. Outside, sun was shining. We had the mayor over, really nice. It was like we are finishing on a high point. And that was really important, I think, to me and to the staff. So in one sense, yes, it was easier to go back from a purely logistical level. But the emotion piece has been difficult. Now, I suppose staff are amazing and their resilience and that is amazing, because people straight away said, okay, we're back in this now is what we can do, bump, 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 bump. And we're now going to try and do some building work. We're going to try and get other things done in the time. But so they're kind of having to reverse. And I suppose it's that the psychological phases, that regression. And I suppose locking down was easy. It's all of the confusion now around reopening and what does that look like and mean. And then I suppose there's the fear amongst colleagues that are we going up another level, which would take us even further into a lockdown in Dublin. So, yeah.
Fingers crossed we come out of that. Jakob, did I see you raise your hand briefly? Yeah, do you want to come in there?
So I was just, I can recognize what you said about the authorities being very clear in the beginning and then kind of blurry in the process that followed. I think that what we experienced was some very clear top-down messages in the beginning. And then when you started the reopening, they actually requested some bottom-up information. And they're also requesting that now in Denmark, in Copenhagen. We now have a situation where we are seeing a second wave slowly, but they don't want to lock down and open again all the time. So actually there's a lot more responsibility now on institutions and local managers to find out how to handle the situation. And I think quarantine of books was a good example, because actually we tried to look for information from other countries in order to influence our authority to not quarantine books. And we looked to Ireland and Switzerland and we didn't find what we needed. So instead we looked to Norway and Singapore, who didn't quarantine book, and we pointed to those two library systems which are highly regarded, and actually we ended up with a recommendation not to quarantine books. But that was an example that the authorities, after the initial reaction, started to request information actually from us. And they're doing it also now, because now we have to handle the epidemic without closing and opening all the time.
And I would say in Ireland we have a higher visibility with several government departments as a result of the way that we were actually able to manage the lockdown and then the way up. Whether that's a good thing in the long run, we hope it is, but we'll see. Tabitha, you had your hand up there, and I was going to ask you as well about sort of how you coordinated a response across all of those libraries, particularly in the moment we're at now, when I think you're open again, aren't you? And you have to get everybody back up and running.
Yeah, so we had quite clear guidance from government. It hasn't always, but in this particular, we were given a date when libraries could reopen, and there are still some library services across the country that aren't yet open. But we took that date as our kind of green light, and we piloted in 4 libraries browsing and computer use, and we really completely redesigned how a space was used with social distancing and had very clear safety measures in place. And we rolled that out gradually and kind of built up from some smaller libraries into our big kind of city centre library. So we had services in all of our libraries from the start of opening. So we had choose and collect as well as our digital services across the board. But it meant that we had a really clear programme of reopening, and it felt so positive, I think, to take it steady, but to have very definite ambition to get all of our libraries back open. But what we're finding now is that we are seeking to scenario plan, because we have kind of localised lockdowns across the country now, and those are all so decisions are being made by government, but there are also local decisions being made about how the virus is being spread, understanding that from a local level, and then making adjustments based on that. So actually, it's quite hard for us to kind of know what might happen at a local level in terms of triggers for a local lockdown. But we are thinking about what services we might want to keep open. So, for example, our digital service, and we were getting around 600,000 hours worth of computer use and Wi-Fi use a year before lockdown. So really vital service for people that don't have computers at home and might be studying and want to have a space for that. So we're thinking about, well, if there is a local lockdown, what absolutely is something that we would fight to keep, physically open, whilst we might continue to do, delivering services, books to people's homes via bike, via post, or choose and collect that we've been offering. I think the digital services, especially during a recession, especially when people are now coming out of furlough and are being made redundant, our role in helping people to find employment, to build their skills around digital technology remains something that I'm really keen that we don't pull from under people. So we're having those conversations, but it still feels at the moment that we don't really know whether we'll be able to do that. And what the guidelines from government or from the local lockdown decision makers will be, but there's definitely an ambition there to try and support communities as best we can for the long term, because this isn't going to end anytime soon, is it?
Yeah, and actually, and I'm going to agree with Sandra in the chat there that that idea of finding that absolutely core offering when we're locked down that we don't want to give any inches on if we possibly can, and that we actually really want to make available. Be interesting to see if we all agreed on that. But Francisco, I'm going to come to you, and I wonder if you and Joris can also reflect, please pick up whatever you want first, but that kind of element that we have, the three of us in the NAPLE context of international information sharing, how useful that was, and then which ones did you pick to go with? I think Jakob, we couldn't help him out with our Irish approach, so he's gone to Singapore. Like how do you get the one that you want? But Francisco, what do you have to say?
Well, I think to Swiss libraries, it was in the end a very unprecedented thing that was happening. But what was very quickly sure for everybody is that libraries should never close down again, and there should never be again a physical lockdown of libraries, because online and virtually they have all been open also in Switzerland during the whole period. But still, the closing the doors of libraries set up injustice in society even more, and those that were already weak before, they became, let's say, even weaker during this period of time. And I think we have to be prepared for, like, in these constant waves that we will face now. I'm sure we will, to never have to close down completely again. And I think associations and national broader structures can do an amazing job in helping single libraries, especially small libraries with not so developed structures, to maintain basic services. And that, of course, can be something different wherever you are. It's not defined like what is for your community the most important service. But I think that's the main point of interest for all those that think about more like broader level, not for a single library, but for a more structural.
Coordinated sort of national sort of. Joris, do you want to throw in on that?
Well, yeah. As I mentioned before, information, concrete guidelines were essential for libraries in the beginning, because when the government decides your library has to be closed, it's simple, it's closed. But in Flanders, in Belgium, they had to remain open. So libraries sort of had to reinvent a part of their service and adapt it to a takeaway or an home delivery service. And most libraries were able to do that, were capable of doing that. But the whole context of a pandemic, with all the questions about safety, quarantining books, is it necessary, is it not necessary, how long, all those questions came along. And we got a lot of questions in the beginning weeks. And together with the Library Association, just as Francisca told, we tried to look for answers. But especially in the beginning, that was not easy. because also the insights of experts, doctors, government about the virus, about what to do best, changed continuously, and that made it even harder. Nevertheless, what we did was, together with the Library Association in Flanders, we tried to compile guides with concrete measures, with concrete guidelines, first for takeaway library, and then in a later phase for the reopening of the libraries. And we were very lucky that we did not have to invent the warm water, as we say in Belgium and in Flemish. We did not have to invent everything ourselves, but we could rely on information from international colleagues. I'm still very grateful for the initiative from NAPLE. NAPLE started somewhere in March, I think, by sending some emails with questions from, can you please share some experiences, some information about the situation in your country? And it evolved into spreadsheets, reports. That was very, very helpful, because when in the end of April, the National Security Council in Belgium decided about an exit strategy for the whole country, and they drew a timeline with phases, and then we began, in cooperation with the Library Association, to compile an exit guideline, if you may call it. But we could never have done that without all the information of other countries. All the insights, the practical concepts, even information from experts in other countries, for example, about quarantining, was very, very, very helpful.
Yeah, I'd second that from the perspective of us here in Ireland, and sort of being able to pull in from other places is really something. There's a couple of interesting bits though in the chat there that were raised, which we might get onto just to finish up in the last 20 minutes. And also I'd encourage anybody in the chat there who's got a question, just throw it into the chat with a question mark, and we'll see if we can come to it. But I think it was Kat from the US who's raised a question there, which for me is about sort of, the perception of the library. She's mentioned there, that library and library staff by extension have to start providing social services despite the health risk, lack of training or fair compensation. Now that certainly hasn't happened anywhere, but in Ireland, when we've had some of Catherine's staff involved in contact tracing and we're kind of gone beyond the initial offer, it's interesting maybe to reflect on the perceptions that people now have of our service. And I might start with Silke at that local level again, do you think your users, do they still have the same conception of you as they did in February, or has it changed, or what? And if it has changed, what's changed?
I think the side of us from our users has changed because we win many new users in the time of lockdown because of our digital services. We made special offers for new users to explore us, and so it was for us in the crisis also a very good time, because we were the only one cultural institution who were inside of users, of the citizens. They saw, okay, there is an offer from the local, from the city, and this is the library, the public library. Only first step digital, after some weeks with a delivering offer, ordering services of books, and then some weeks later with the reopening first step. And but the weeks where nobody, where the doors are closed, we were always in the look of the citizens, and we were the only institution who had some offers or some services for the citizens. And this was I heard it from many customers and visitors of the library in the last weeks. Oh, this was very good for our family, for our kids. We had a little cultural or little book offer in this time.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Catherine, do you want to come in there? Because you might also want to talk about, because I mean, you're very embedded in the local authority and the visibility of the library in that context, maybe.
I think actually, just to take on board that, it's actually really interesting. Somebody passed a comment about kind of maybe end of March, mid-April, and internally passed a comment, who'd have thought people would have missed the library? And I just think it spoke to so much of how we were viewed and how we were seen. But also, this was a very different kind of crisis. Normally, if it's a storm, you need the guys out clearing the trees and fixing the drains. This was a softer crisis where you needed your cultural services. So I think our essentialness became far more enhanced during this particular situation. The response from the public, as Silke said, we never closed. We remained delivering an offer throughout. And that really resonated with our audiences, both internal and external. Yes, we saw huge growth in digital use, huge growth in the numbers of people participating, but just generally the optics of a service that never closed has done us a huge amount, I feel, of good in the kind of shorter term. And I think that's really kind of came, but the piece that resonated most was the fact that libraries took it upon themselves to try and serve the people who are most adversely affected by the situation. And in a broader kind of community sense, that showcased the trust that people have in us and the fact that we are very close to our communities and we are very responsive to our communities. And I think just internally, that gave us a renewed sense of the importance of the softer service within the harder services that often local government offers. You might sense it.
Yeah, there's a comment in the comments from Jakob Pettison. I think Jakob Pettison can address that comment, perhaps.
Yeah. Yes, I was just saying that we discussed that leading up to this meeting, that this might be considered a more basic threat to library thinking. Because if you cannot trust the books being returned, and if you cannot use the library space to meet other people and strengthen community, it's a fundamental threat to library thinking. And of course, we had the digital library open, but I think that we saw, at least from our politicians, that they focused more on a narrow library concept of the lending of books as being the essential service, and that's a more classic library conception than the more expanded one we try to promote in Scandinavia. And if I should be critical of our way of doing things, because I think our librarians have done a marvelous job on the digital side, but I don't think we've succeeded in creating the digital library space as we have a physical library space. I don't think we digitally have succeeded in building connections between people. We've used the digital library to lend out books, and we've been very successful in that regard, but we haven't succeeded in connecting these isolated individuals and creating a digital community. We've used the social media for other purposes, to promote literature and other things. So there's some learning to be done there, I think, going forward.
I'm going to go to Geert because he's got his hand up, but I definitely agree with that from our perspective. We moved very quickly in Ireland to get story time online, and sort of maybe online activities that involved a presentation in some respects to the users, and they were hugely well received, I have to say. But as you go further down that line, that element of interaction and connection is the thing that we have to build, and I think at the moment when there's a gap before we get there. So I'd agree with Jakob. Geert, do you want to come in there? No, sorry, Joris. Sorry, my mistake. It's in the
Well, I wanted to react to what Jakob was saying about the fact that the perception, the concept of the library was narrowed to the transactions, to lending books, lending materials, and of course, during the crisis, it was perhaps a natural thing. I don't think it could be any other way. But on the other hand, if you look back now on the crisis, what people missed the most was the social aspect of libraries. Everything connected with third place, with social connections. And what I am a bit afraid for as a civil servant, as someone from a department, is that politicians and policymakers will narrow public libraries to lending, to transactions. Mm-hmm. And we fought so many years to expand that view from collections to connections. Mm-hmm. I think we should invest even more in the social aspects of public libraries, and even more make visible how important those aspects are for local communities.
Mm-hmm. Tabitha, I'm going to let you make a comment. We're going to address it from a video just as we get near the end. So Tabitha.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build on what Catherine was saying about people coming back to us, and we had quite a lot of feedback that the library was the first place that people came to when they came back out of lockdown. And so as those trusted spaces, we're actually helping communities to come back together again in terms of getting outside of their houses. But this whole idea of us as social venues, I think, is something that we need to put so much more time into thinking about, and whether that's a digital space or being a safe haven for, you know, communities to come together. Maybe not right now with the kind of second wave coming, but I think that we mustn't lose sight of that, because, you know, we've like you say, Joris, we really have worked very hard to be the third place for people to kind of come together, and actually when we come out the other side of this crisis, that's what communities are going to need. Is we're going to need to be there to be rebuilding. And so it's how we position ourselves now, isn't it, to be seen, to be able to play that role now and in the future. So yeah, we've got a job to do.
Indeed. Joris, go.
Well, I just wanted to add, during one of our NAPLE meetings, I learned from a colleague of Portugal that in Portugal libraries, they created some kind of digital forums, digital meeting places during lockdown, where people who did not were able to come to the public libraries because they were closed, they could virtually meet. And they tried digitally, to fill in the gap of the social needs. And I think I found that a very good example, a very inspiring example of what is possible. And I think even in a normal world, post-COVID, we should invest in that kind of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Catherine, you've got your hand up there, and then I'm going to come to Francisca in case you've got a quick comment, Francisca, and then we'll just see what's in the chat. Catherine.
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if it was Francisca. Just to pick up on Joris's point there, we moved some of our, obviously, kind of things like book clubs or discussion pieces online, and interestingly attracted in some ways a different and a broader audience than we would have had with the physical event. Yeah. But what I think about for a lot of our public is what I call the micro disappointments. Their return to their space has been beset by micro disappointments. The lack of a newspaper, the lack of a comfy chair, the lack sometimes of the social piece. And it is an issue that I think we really need to focus on. One of our unique pieces is the public trust. We have safe spaces, we have created safe spaces, and how do we ensure that that third space or that social safe space doesn't get lost in reducing our services transactions? And I suppose, just in case I don't get a chance to say it, we've also been very lucky in Ireland in that we have a very coordinated, we have a national strategy which Stuart kind of works on, and so there was a lot of support provided at a national level, which was really, really invaluable and really helpful to kind of get as well.
Francisca, do you want to make any comments? And then I want you guys to reflect a little bit on, because it is tied into everything that we just talked. The question from a video in the chat, which would be, what would be your recommendations for Eastern libraries, which have less technology, lower budgets, and a poorer image to get through this crisis? Now, he's focused on Eastern libraries there, but obviously, libraries that have less technology, lower budget, that's unfortunately plenty of us. So just have a quick think about that, because we might sort of begin to close by sort of thinking about the recommendations if we had to do all this again. Franziska.
Yeah. Well, I just try to improvise on this, because I think it's kind of the keyword, improvisation, and maybe the COVID situation set free some fantasies for improvisation on different levels. And what was very useful to us was really talking to the communities. Like, we organized a huge open Zoom with all the libraries in Switzerland that could take part on this. It was a moderated talk in 3 languages, and we just gained a lot of experience and ideas by this. And I think this is something that in a moment where you literally don't know what comes next, can be very, not just helpful, but also reassuring about that there's a lot of brain power and enthusiasm and engagement all around. So I think that's available for almost everybody now after this first experience. So we all do Teams and Zoom and whatever,
Yeah, harnessing some of that to take it forward is right. Yeah. So Silke, what would you sort of say if there was, one major lesson you wanted to take forward? And was there anything that you'd rather not do again?
Difficult question. Yes, I don't do very quickly decisions. I think for us in Gütersloh, we have a reopening in 5-6 steps, defined in 5-6 steps. And so we have a paper where we can choose, okay, now it's a situation of a local lockdown or a special lockdown only in the schools. And so we can go after to step 4 or to step 3. And this is for us maybe our new organization structure, where we can manage decisions and services but also the communication also with the community. What Catherine and the others said. This is also a lesson that there we have to learn a third place in maybe local lockdown phases or sessions.
Tabitha, I might ask you just for your sort of thoughts at the end here.
So I think one of the things that I have definitely taken from all of this is about the focus that we need to have on people. And I think as libraries, we do that anyway, but actually, understanding the effort that takes early on, and just kind of, putting everything else down. And I think what I learned early on is that if you're firefighting, you'll never get ahead of it. So actually, you almost need to draw a line in the sand and create some headspace to think, how can we start to behave differently so we can get out the front of it and stop, getting enough information out so that we don't have the 50 questions coming in that we're all trying to answer independently. So I think, that whole communication piece is absolutely key.
That's great. That's good. Joris, what about yourself?
Well, I think for me personally, and from my role as a library policy officer, I think sharing is the most important lesson that I learned. Sharing information. And I was very amazed how large my network can be if the crisis is big enough, and this one was big enough. And I have a very warm feeling about that, I must say.
That's
You're never alone.
Yeah, that's really positive. It's nothing like a big crisis to create a big network, I think we can say.
Definitely.
Catherine, what about the Irish perspective?
Thinking particularly of the Leary perspective, I think to look to what your public or what your customer or what your user is actually asking for, and then to try and respond to that. And I think the collegiate sense, there is people came together in a really interesting way. But I suppose fundamentally, perfection can trump and can progress. You just sometimes have to just do it. And you make your decision, you look at what you have to do, and then you live with it. And if you had more time, more resources, more everything, but this, in that moment, this is what you decided, and you live with your decisions. And that's kind of important too, because if you're leading a section, people are looking to you to not be completely indecisive. They may not always agree with, but they will accept that, yes, you're making a decision. There's a kind of a trust piece there too. That's kind of
owning your decisions. Yeah. Francisca, did you get everything in your intervention, or you anything? Yeah, you did. All right. Well, Jakob, what have you got to say?
I think actually one of the learnings, as I said earlier, was that I think we did more of the same digitally, but I think we should have done more new things. And we're used to developing new services by meeting physically, brainstorming, workshops, and I think we should develop a capability to develop new services digitally. And I think we should be better to use using social media to not to communicate what we need to communicate or promote literature, but to create connections. And I think we're going to work a bit on that.
Yeah, I'd say that's been our experience here too. I mean, I'm personally am very happy remote working, but you can have as many meetings as you want using these tools, but to actually brainstorm something and develop something is very tough. I'll throw in one never to do again thing from my side before we wrap up, and I think I would never again talk of the library being closed. I'd ban that word from any communications. Reopening is not the way to do it. You know, we stayed open, but we kind of let our mindset get into the idea that we closed, you know, and I think that's an interesting that we might sort of maintain a different way of communicating it in future. Anyway, with all that being said, I want to thank, to be honest, first of all, everybody who's been following all of this chat in the comments, because there's an awful lot of stuff in there. I don't know if the other panelists have had time, I think, to check it, but people have been supplying links, throwing good pieces of information in. I've seen some familiar names and faces in the chat. So thank you all for sticking with us. We've had, you know, over sort of 45 people, including the panelists, for the whole thing. So I'm really happy with everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for taking time out of their afternoons to join us. I hope you guys have had a reasonable time. And if I ever decide to go professional on the chat show circuit, I'll try and bring you all back for a future appearance. And with that, Anchor, I think we'll say thank you very much, and our session is finished.
Thank you so much, so much, so many answers, so many more questions. And I invite all of you and all the people that attended this wonderful session to also go to the expo, because we are not closed, we are open here at Occupy, we are open. So there's one more hour, and there's IFLA people waiting for you to see their wonderful activities in their live booth. Also, there is this workshop from P2P University, so we still have content in the expo. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and share with us all this horrible but also happy ending that hope stories from all these countries. See you in the expo.
Thank you. See you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.